What does it really mean to be unshakable? It's not just a matter of money, it's a state of mind. When you're truly unshakable, you have an unwavering confidence amidst the storm. It's not that nothing upsets you, we all get hooked at times, but you just don't stay there. Nothing rattles you for any length of time. This state of mind allows you to be a leader, not a follower, to be the chess player, not the chess piece, to be one of the few who do, not the many who talk.
Hi, my name is Richard Bradley, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Worth Magazine. Welcome back to the Unshakable podcast. We're here today to talk about something that, aside from home ownership, is the most common investment for Americans: contributions to employer-sponsored retirement plans. Nearly 90 million Americans are putting away money from their paycheck, with most of them participating in 401k plans. For many, it's the only retirement plan that they have, and what they're banking on, literally, to provide financial security in their later years. But as he was writing his first book, Money Master the Game, Tony Robbins discovered that there are some enormous problems with 401ks, problems that were costing Americans a year's worth of retirement income. To write Unshakable, the financial freedom playbook, he took yet another look at the 401k industry with the help of one of his, Tom Zagainer, from America's Best 401k, the company that Tony himself uses for his company's 401k plans. Tony's son Josh Robbins also joined forces and now serves as Chief Marketing Officer for the company. Welcome, Tom and Josh, to the Unshakable podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us today, guys. So, Tom, why don't we start with you? Talk about what is the number one problem with most 401k plans today?
Well, Richard, as you mentioned at the top, aside from home ownership, this really is the primary investment vehicle that we're using as Americans to build financial resources to sustain ourselves after our active work life is completed. And with over $6 trillion currently invested in 401k plans, there's going to be an enormous mathematical consequence of when there's going to be excessive or perhaps needless fees inside these plans. And while they're not necessarily hidden, we like to say that they're hiding in plain sight because the typical plan participant or plan sponsor really doesn't have a handle on it. And if you look at really for 3 decades plus, the financial services industry, the companies who are in the business of providing 401k plans, they were not even required by law to disclose how much they're charging their customers. Think about it.
Let me second, Tom, because I think that's worth repeating. For decades, the people who ran these plans didn't even have to tell the people who were in them what their fees were.
It's crazy to think about that we would buy anything in our life in any manner, right? If we went shopping today, or we're going to travel today, or going to buy something today, that we would do it without knowing what it costs. And yet, here's the thing we need for when we're 65 to 90 years old, and for all that time, they didn't have to tell us. And even still today, and we'll talk a little bit later about the disclosure rules that change things somewhat, still over 70% of participants in 401k plans still believe that there are no associated investment-related costs, which kind of goes to our lack of basic financial acumen, not even understanding that mutual funds or index funds actually have an inherent cost built into it.
I think that's an astonishing fact, actually. 71% of people who are enrolled in 401ks do not know that there are any fees involved whatsoever.
It's sort of you work each week and you have a biweekly or semi-monthly and monthly payroll, and money comes out of your pay and it goes into your 401k, and you occasionally look at your balance and you see it grow, and maybe it grows a little and maybe it grows a lot. But the mathematical consequence of the fees mitigating returns over time are not even on the radar. And a lot of these funds that providers have on their core lineup, or maybe a broker or payroll company put in place, there can be more than a dozen different fees inside of them that are chipping away at their returns over time.
So, Tom, when did that change? When did 401k providers become required to provide a fee disclosure?
In July of 2012, after about 3 years of back and forth legislation to try to get a disclosure of some sort brought forth, in July of 2012, a document called a 408B2 was starting to be necessarily provided by plan providers to the plan sponsor. That's the employer version. In August of that year, a different version called a 404A5, a participant disclosure, became into law where each participant in the plan had to receive that disclosure. The problem is that where it should provide clarity, it actually provides more confusion. Providers hide them on their website. They're not easily obtained even when you call the provider. These documents could be 30 to 50 pages long. They're in English, and there's numbers that we've learned from grade school. But when you put it all together, it's a document that makes no sense because there's no context to them.
You mentioned, used the phrase hiding in plain sight for these fees. So if you take all the people who are enrolled in 401ks, and you subtract the 71% of people who don't know that they're fees, there are 29% of people left who do know that they're fees. How many of them, Tom, do you think could even find the fees if once they actually know that the fees exist?
Hardly any, and here's why. There's not congruency between the employer version and the participant version. For example, on a participant version, you might see a core fund lineup and their expense ratios. But then there will be verbiage that says additional administrative fees may apply, or additional asset-based fees may apply. Contact your administrator. So even if you wanted to try to sit down and find the effects of fees for yourself, it's still not on the document because now you're required to go to your employer. Then the employer starts to dig up their version of it, and ostensibly there should be those fees noted there. And then sometimes on their fee disclosure document, it'll say, please refer to your contract to find that fee. So it's, even though the financial services industry is appealing to the letter of the law by providing disclosures, man, they're making it really difficult for people to come up with the end sum that's affecting them over time.
Right. So most people don't know that there are fees. And the people who do know that there are fees find it impossible to find them and know what they actually are. Tom and Josh, talk a little bit about what these fees mean for the average worker. Like, let's start small. Say you got someone who earns $30,000 a year and saves 5% of his or her annual income, which is for someone who's making $30,000 a year a substantial savings, right? That's a significant amount of money to put aside. How do these fees affect their savings and their returns?
Yeah, this is a great exercise because, again, when fees sound small, you hear 1% or 2% and you think, does that really make a difference? But when you think about the impact of those fees over time, that's really what people have to fully understand and get their arms around. There was a great study by a think tank, bipartisan think tank called Demos, and there was a gentleman there by the name of Robert Hilton Smith, who's a full PhD, and he's one of the ones who went on this excursion to try to find how many fees he was paying and what fees he was paying, and found out there was over 17 different fees that could be applied in a fee disclosure. And
17 different fees.
17 different fees, yeah. And so he looked at this and said, okay, so what does that really mean to the average worker? So a $30,000 a year employee saving 5%, as we said, loses about $154,000 to fees over their lifetime. And that's an astonishing number. But what's more astonishing would be how much more money they would have if that money would have been put to work and was actually compounding. So that's just the fee amount. But if you actually were to say, okay, if that money were put back, what would that have grown to? And it really means the difference between the ability to retire and the ability not to. So our general rule of thumb, Richard, is that if you look at it over time, a typical market return of 7% over time, a 1% reduction in fees. So someone who's paying 2% versus someone who's paying 1%. All things being equal, they both have the same returns. The person with the higher fees, their money's going to last 10 years less. Their money's going to run out 10 years earlier than the person with the lower fees, with the 1% in fees. So
and that I think is particularly important to think about when you realize that people are living longer these days and hoping to retire sooner. But in fact, what's happening in part because they're worried about being able to support themselves during retirement is they're living longer, but they're also working a lot longer.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, baby boomers, their number one fear is not death. And their number one fear is actually running out of money too early. In other words, sadly to say, they'd rather be dead than broke. And that's a very real fear for people. And so people there's an epidemic in our country in the 401k space of overpaying for underperformance. And that's really what we have here. And that same study, just to continue that forward, if you are maybe a higher income earner and you're listening to this podcast, someone who's making $90,000 a year and say they're stocking away 5% as well, they're actually going to lose closer to $300,000, about $277,000 in fees over their lifetime. But again, if that money would have been working for them, how much more would that $277,000 would have compounded to? $500,000, $750,000 of additional monies they would have had to sustain themselves later in life. So,
Tom, what happens? I'm sorry to interrupt, Josh, but let me throw a question at Tom. So, what happens if I'm a teacher? So, I'm not using a 401k, but rather a 403b. Isn't that better?
It sadly can be far worse. 403b plans, if you compare them to a typical 401k plan, which has a core fund lineup put together by someone, an advisor, a provider, a record keeper, whoever, typically a core fund lineup, one lineup. With a lot of these 403b plans, you'll have multiple providers. So a teacher on 401k day, they may have 5 or 6 different investment providers, wildly different companies involved, with completely different perspectives on how they approach things and the funds they offer to choose from. It almost becomes a marketplace. And what we see in a lot of these plans is that the fees are even more excessive than those in 401k plans. One we saw recently where they're charged up to 2% on every bit of savings to manage their plan. For every dollar that goes in, another 6% sales charge, a front-end load, so to speak, is added to it. So think about it, 8% in fees the first year alone.
Yeah, that's crushing.
It's totally crushing. They exist in 401k plans, but candidly, not as egregious as we see in the 403b market. And it's sad, right? These are our educators. A lot of the educators are math educators. And yet the thing that they're teaching is the thing that's actually working against them as they try to plan for their life after active work. And if I can mention...
Of course.
If I can mention it to Josh's point earlier when he talked about, the fear of baby boomers. The adage is out there that we never worry about our money until we do. And it's these little things that we do today that we're not really cognizant of what's going on today. They're going to have a consequence 20 years from now when we retire, 15 years from when we retire. So it's really a matter of paying attention to keeping your eye on the ball now to see where that ball is going to land 20 years out.
Tom, I know that you guys at America's Best have done a lot of research into this subject, a lot of research into fees, what they are, how to find them, what kind of effect they have upon people's investments and returns. How could people access that information from you all at America's Best 401k?
Well, there's a couple of ways to start. We built something unique, our fee checker that's available either at americasbest401k.com or a participant-driven site called itsyourmoney.com, where you could enter in the name of your plan. This is a database that includes all existing 401k plans in the United States. And it'll give you an initial analysis based upon plans similar to yours. So if you have $1 million plan, it's comparing you to all the $1 million plans out there in the United States. It gives you a sample report compared to industry averages. But where we really want to go forward from there, Richard, is to be precise, to be absolute. And that's why we ask either the plan sponsor or the plan participant to send us those fee disclosures I mentioned earlier. That's really the treasure map for us. It provides the optics to provide an accurate diagnosis, because the other thing that does not exist in the disclosure documents is that it's not taking into account time. Time is the critical aspect of all here, because you can see 1% or 1.5% or this fee or that fee. But until it's put into context of your plan balance or the company's plan balance and annual contributions year after year going forward with that hypothetical return rate that Josh mentioned earlier, 7%, for example, factoring all the expenses, you really have no idea if where you are going is a place you remotely want to end up until you introduce those elements. So that's what we do for people on a complementary basis.
And Josh, how do people find out sort of the things that their 401k provider doesn't easily tell them?
Yeah, so there's a we wanted to create a very clear and concise kind of indictment, if you will, across the industry. And there's really, this can might sound complex to the listener, but really there's really about 5 things that your 401k provider doesn't want you to know or understand. So we built a report to that effect. It's called the 5 things your 401k provider doesn't want you to know. And it's right there available on the homepage at americasbest401k.com. And so for business owners, it's a fantastic read. For participants, spread it around your colleagues, and if you have access to the ownership and HR of your business, because frankly, it's not, employers are busy, right? They're busy running their business. They're usually just, 401k is a check the box item. No, they're not trying to, your employer's not making money off you. These are the 401k providers. So the employers have every incentive and desire to want to help their employees. They just typically don't know that this is happening either. So it's a great report to pass along and to spread the word. So we feel like it's the best. A lot of secrets here that if we can get out there and kind of pull back the curtain, everybody would be better served.
And sorry, that's at americasbest401k.com?
That's correct. Right on the homepage there. Thank you.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the law and the politics around this, because those are important aspects of this. A lot of folks don't know it, but this is actually a subject that Washington has started to focus on in the past couple of years. I remember in early 2015, I think it was, the Obama administration started to get involved with this issue. And as part of the push toward legislation around a fiduciary standard, which is something that Tony Robbins and Peter Mallouk of Creative Planning talk about in another podcast episode, those guys made it clear that all brokers and advisors working in the retirement space must always be acting in their clients' best interests. So that was a pretty important change. Let me just repeat that because it is a big deal. All brokers and advisors working in the retirement space must always be acting in their clients' best interests. So the White House Council of Economic Advisors, I saw, issued a report that, quote, hidden fees and backdoor payments are costing Americans more than $17 million a year. Have things gotten better since then? It's about 2 years later now. Tom, do you want to talk to that?
I don't really think so, because it's the percentages of where are most 401k plans residing. If we think that there's close to 650,000 401k plans out there, most of those are with 2 national payroll companies, 15 to 20 insurance companies, and a couple of fund companies. The problems are the inherent conflicts of interest. So if, for example, you're a big payroll company, you're using a core list of funds for most of your clients, where the payroll company, simply as a matter of convenience of integration with payroll, is providing these 401k services, might be getting 25 to 75 basis points in revenue sharing from the pay-to-play funds on their platform, with no value exchange occurring. Payroll company, remember, not a fiduciary in any measure. Or through a lot of the broker-driven insurance company models, now you have multiple layers. You have a broker-dealer that gets paid. The broker gets paid. The fund company gets paid. Often the provider gets paid. How do they get paid? It has to come from either inside the expense ratios of the funds or by adding fees on top. The bottom line is, regardless of fee disclosure, regardless of expected transparency, regardless of putting the needs of the client first, you still have a lot of folks who have determined that this is their 401k plan, not the plan participant's 401k plan. So these layers of fees are batting added on top of it. So it has not improved. We review hundreds of plans every month. Nothing's changing in that model.
And Josh, I imagine that inertia has something to do with this, right? A company has set up its 401k plan. Everything seems to be working fine. No one's complaining because they don't really know how much better they could be doing. So why bother? Just no one's paying any attention to it, right?
Absolutely. And that's it's the frog in the boiling water concept, right? I mean, that's really the way that they want it, is for no one to start asking questions. And start looking around. I mean, even when you ask your provider where my fee disclosure is, or how do I get a copy of my fee disclosure, that's such a rare question that it even raises red flags when the provider hears this question. Is why would you need see your fee disclosure? It's just such an unusual question. So, and I think with the we're going back to the law for just a quick second. The DOL law has a tremendous
That's
number.
the Department of Labor?
Yeah, correctly. Sorry, the Department of Labor law. It really has a number of carve-outs and caveats. So, yes, the law, which, by the way, could potentially, depending on when you're listening to this, be rolled back or postponed by the Trump administration. We're not sure yet. However, what this law does is it says, hey, yeah, you've got to act in your best interest. However, there's a lot of buts attached to it. You can still generate commissions. You could still participate in revenue sharing, which is a fancy word for pay to play, meaning the mutual funds. You ever wonder why the mutual funds on your list to choose from, you say, who selected those, and why are those the ones? If there's thousands of them out there, why are there these 15 or 20 or 30? And the reason is...
So I'd like to think it's because some really smart person somewhere looked at a whole bunch of funds and decided that these were the best ones.
That's ideal. The problem is that the funds that are on that are the ones on the shelf are the ones that are paying the most typically to be offered to you. So their expenses.
But so I'm sorry. Wait a second. I feel like that's a huge point.
It is.
So the funds that are in your 401k plan aren't there necessarily because they were chosen by the plan administrator on the basis of merit. They're there because the guys who sell the funds are paying to put them in your 401k plan.
Absolutely. Yeah, the funds themselves are there just like if you were to walk into a retail store and those products are on the shelf because they generate a great margin. The same is true for mutual funds in your 401k plan. They are paying to be on that platform in 99% of the time, which of course is passed on directly to you in the form of increased costs. They can be insanely expensive. So, expense ratios, we've seen expense ratios as high as 2.5, 3.5. I think our record is 5%, a 5% annual expense ratio, which is just astronomical. So yeah, they're absolutely paying to be offered.
Can I piggyback
so
off of that?
5% means that yeah.
Well, the crazy part about what Josh just mentioned is that if you have a broker on the plan who's not a fiduciary, or a payroll company who's not a fiduciary, or you went to some provider that just said you can pick these funds or those funds, they're not a fiduciary. The plan sponsor, the business owner, under ERISA, is a fiduciary, meaning if you have discretion in administering or managing the plan, or you control the plan's assets, like choosing the investment options, or choosing the firm that offers those investments, that business owner is a fiduciary to the extent that's discretionary control over the plan. And further to that is that you may have not been told this as a plan sponsor, but when you, as an ERISA fiduciary, act for called the exclusive purpose of providing benefits to the plan, that person is legally bound to do so at the level of a hypothetical expert. So a business owner probably doesn't know that if they don't appoint a fiduciary, they are one, and they're the de facto expert, and the ERISA expects you to carry out those functions as if you had that professional knowledge. But by the way, they're running their business.
Tom, the law says that business owners actually have to play a fiduciary role for their employees, which means that they have to choose a 401k and administer a 401k that is in the best interests of the employees. I bet many business owners don't even realize that.
Sadly, they do not. When I mention the phrase, do you know that your fees must be both reasonable and prudent, and the plan must be for the sole benefit of its employees? That language is fresh language that's never passed their ears.
So pretty powerful language, but not if people don't actually know about it. And I imagine enforcement is probably minimal. And as Josh suggested, we have no idea what will happen in the months and years to come in terms of enforcement, maybe a rollback, something of that nature.
The stunning part, if I spoke to 100 plan sponsors this week, and I said, let's go forward and do a side-by-side comparison of your plan, Let's first get a copy of your 408b2. At least 70 to 75% will say, what is that? I have never reviewed it. I'm not sure where to get it. Where do I get it? What does that document contain? And here we are in 2017, something that has been published since July of 2012 under the law of ERISA. They are to read it, articulate it, make changes if necessary. And most well-intentioned employers, again, so deeply into running their business, have no idea even that this document exists and the information it contains. And then when we extract the information that it contains, that's when shock and awe comes into play, where they almost can't believe the effects of time.
Right. Well, so from the participant of the investor, the employee, we've all been hearing a lot in the past few years about the benefits of ETFs, exchange traded funds, which are basically very low cost, passively managed funds. That means that they don't have an investment manager who's buying in and out of the stock market every day. Should these folks, for them, is it just as simple as using low cost index funds in your company's plan and avoiding these expensive actively managed funds?
It's certainly in the right direction. I would say that many of the largest plans, the big companies like, I always say Apple probably doesn't have a 401k problem, right? The biggest plans are typically have those type of low-cost funds. However, it goes back to what I talked about earlier. Low-cost funds don't offer commissions, and they're extremely inexpensive. And so that throws a little bit of a wrench in the plan. And when we talked about the mutual funds getting paying to be on the shelf. So if there's no ability for the index funds to charge enough to be able to pay the providers are usually very reluctant. So typically what we see is, even though there's certainly a popularity to a move towards low-cost index funds like Vanguard and others, what you see is in the vast majority of plans, 90% of the plans, where they're small businesses, right? Doctors, dentists, lawyers, manufacturers, etc., they don't offer those type of index funds in the plan. They don't offer them. And then what they'll tell you typically is you don't qualify. And what that means is we don't make enough money off your size of plan in order to offer you low-cost index funds, okay? So that's typically what you'll hear. The second thing is that what we have started to see is they have started to acquiesce and say, yeah, we'll put low-cost index funds in your plan. But they're not going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg that quickly. And so what you end up seeing is a couple, what I call sleight of hand moves. Number one is you'll see markups. So I'll give you an example. We see typically where like an S&P 500 index fund might cost 5 basis points or 0.05%. We see them often for 1 or 1.5, one as high as 1.68%. So that's a 3,600% markup.
So these guys are taking super low-cost products, something for which there might be a 0.05% fee, and multiplying that fee by 20, 30 times?
Easy.
In those cases?
Yep.
All the time.
Another group might charge a little less. Like maybe they'll charge, instead of 0.05, they'll charge 0.65. So they'll mark it up, maybe only 12 or 13 times, 12 or 1,300%. But then they'll also charge a sales load, so they'll take 3% on every dollar going in. Another one, we have clients that come to us all the time and say, hey, I think I'm in good shape. I got a low cost lineup of funds, and we'll look at the funds, and on first glance, they'll have really low expense ratios, like 0.05, 0.10, and we go, wow, this looks really good. However, what they often do is they recategorize their revenue in something they typically call it like a contract asset charge or an asset management charge, where they say, oh yeah, sure, you're going to have low-cost index funds, but you know what, we're going to charge 1.5 or 2.5% on the entire plan balance regardless. So they're going to make it one way or the other. So low-cost index funds, although in the general trajectory of the right decision, it's got to be a little bit more, you got to look a little further. A couple layers got to be peeled back.
Well, going back again to the perspective of the business owner, I follow this as the editor of Worth, which is a financial magazine. I see some news articles about business owners who are actually occasionally getting because they are not actually following the letter of this new law and acting in the sole interest of their employees when they choose and administer a 401k plan. Tom, what do business owners need to be aware of, and what can employees do if they're stuck in an expensive plan?
From the business owner's perspective, it is important that on a regular basis that they do a benchmark, fancy word for comparison, as an alternative to their existing providers. And the key is to do it in a non-biased basis. Because if you take it back to your provider and say, compare my plan against others, or back to Joe the broker, who might be your brother-in-law, or whomever, they're going to find a biased way to do that benchmark. But if you go out to a third party, in this case, would be a third party because we're just going to provide numbers to numbers, is that you want to have real clarity on where your plan stands as opposed to what it could be. Again, this goes back to the fact, as a plan sponsor, you are the fiduciary of the plan, and you have a legal obligation to ensure the plan is for the sole benefit of its participants. And this is pretty easy to do. In 2014, it was the Department of Labor added close to 1,100 more examiners. And these examiners are knocking on the doors of businesses across America and doing plan examinations. And there's really 6 things where a plan could be considered or deemed to be out of compliance, with excessive fees that have not been addressed being one of those. This was back in 2014 that the DOL determined that 75% of the plans it examined were illegal, and the average fine to the business owner, this is a personal liability now, was $600,000. And we've seen cases where the plan assets were not relative to the plan fine itself. So that's one path that the employer has to be concerned about. The other thing we have to be concerned about is participant litigation. It's all over the news now. The amount of providers being sued, in many cases, the 401k participants of 401k providers themselves suing their own employer. So think about it. There's been some big insurance companies in the 401k business whose own participants have sued their own employer for the use of proprietary funds that have excessive fees. So it's another case, like we say, of the cook, willing to sell you his food but not eat it himself. So participants are in a bit of a, not tenuous spot, but a sensitive spot. Look, they're employed by someone, right? Everybody wants to keep and maintain their job and hopefully grow to it. But a lot of times participants will come to our website, run a fee checker, will then provide further information to them, and they're like, wow, it looks like we really have a bad plan and could be improved. But there's a general... But they're reticent to go to their employer for fear of any sort of pushback, right? On why are you bringing this to me? And yet it's their money and they feel they have a right. The key reason we try to stress to employees why they should push it up to their employer is the employer has generally the largest balance in the plan and therefore the most to lose. So this is something that's good for everybody.
That's right. That was actually where I was going to go, is that this doesn't necessarily have to be an adversarial conversation or process because, as you pointed out, Tom, the business owner often is going to be the biggest investor in that 401k and probably oftentimes the best paid person in the company. And so the business owner not only has a kind of legal self-interest in making sure that their plan, that he or she is acting as a fiduciary, they also have a financial self-interest in it.
Well, I spoke to an attorney on Tuesday that we met at one of Tony's events last week in Florida. It was a plan with $1.4 million in assets. And to Josh's point earlier, he went out for a day and a half to try to get his fee disclosure. And he sent me all the emails that were going back and forth between his providers saying, Jim, we'll just call him, Attorney Jim has been asking for his fee disclosure. What do we say? How do we get it to him? What should we do? You can see all this. He wrote me an email. He's like, Tom, look at all these emails below. Do they not want me to see this thing? Are they doing something misleading here? This is my information. Why can't I get to it? And when he finally got it, and I knew the data we were going to see because I knew the provider and the size of the plan, he told me that very thing. He said, of the 1.4 million, 850,000 belongs to my wife and I. We're the ones getting really beat up here.
Right.
So the changes they make for themselves now have an intrinsic and residual effect for their employees as well, and they get to be a hero across the board.
Tom, I want to come back to something that you touched upon briefly podcast, which is that I understand that America's Best 401k, a company that Josh also works with as Chief Marketing Officer, you guys have taken it upon yourselves to provide any business with a complimentary cost comparison, sort of a look under the hood. What does that process look like, and what can businesses expect if they hear this podcast, if they're listening to this, and they decide to go to America's Best 401k and take advantage of that offer?
It's really simple to do. We need really two pieces of information. The fee disclosure that I mentioned earlier, and we really like to get a copy of the employer version, the 408B2, because it should have all the data contained or referred to that I can then help them dig a little bit further. That, along with any notation of any invoice fees that they might receive. So what we do is we put this into a very easy-to-read 3-page document that takes into account their existing plan assets, estimated annual contributions, a growth rate, factor in all the expenses, and then we run that out month after month, year after year, out 20 years, and we show the measurables in 5-year increments. So you can start to see and get a glimpse into the future of if you stayed with this plan, as opposed to America's Best 401k, which is going to have all-in investment expenses generally around 0.65%, and the plans we're reviewing on average are 1.5% to 2.5%. You're going to have a visual number that shows that over this period of time, 20 years, that you are going to lose this dollar amount in savings, and that if you were with us over that time, that same dollar amount then correlates, that goes back into your pocket. Now you have a visual to work with. Now you have a real number to latch onto that shows you we're just 2 millimeters of change, just pivoting away from where you are, fundamentally and radically changes the outcome of the business owner, the employees, and their families as well after they stop working.
And that's a substantial number. Let's go back to Joe the attorney and the $1.4 million he's got in the plan. Over 20 years, the difference, the incremental difference, all things being equal, just say the same growth rate, the same contributions, if he stuck with his existing plan versus switching to America's Best. America's Best put an additional over $1 million back into the plan. That goes right back to he and his employees. And that's even being nice, because we say all things being equal, and our plan only uses low-cost index funds. We don't have any brokers. There's no commissions. So his plan is stacked with actively managed mutual funds where there's a broker involved. And so I'm just being nice on the all things being equal. But it's a substantial impact for a small business owner who you think spends day in, day out working so hard to succeed in their business, to be able to put money away, and to let that money just walk out the back door is an unacceptable outcome that's why we say we are in the business of rescuing the retirement plans of Americans.
Tom, let me ask you one final question, if I may. And it goes back again to that issue of inertia. So I imagine that business owners, they simply think that even if they realize that they're overpaying for their plan or the plan's products, they assume that it's a complicated and painstaking and time-consuming procedure to change 401k providers. And you know what? They're too busy running their business. It's a competitive world out there. There's always something that's more pressing. Is it actually that hard to change?
Actually, it's not that hard to change. It's in fact easy to change when you have experts involved. So in our model, we assign a conversion specialist on our end, one person who works with that plan sponsor or their representative to take that plan through its conversion cycle over a 6 to 10 week period of time. And when I say 6 to 10, it's usually in about 6 weeks we're ready to start accepting deferrals on our end. Industry average will show that it takes about 10 weeks for the prior provider to finally send over the assets to the new plan. So we assume all the heavy lifting. At the outset, in fact, we have a new onboarding form where in less than 7 minutes, somebody can get started with us. The summary information we need to get moving. Our team then reaches out to collect the existing plan documents, supporting information, summary plan description, and a census. And then everything shifts to us. So we emphasize to the business owner, keep your eye on the ball on your business. We'll manage this entire process. we connect with the existing providers, the former ones, to facilitate the transfer of the assets. We keep your employees abreast of the change. We then launch a webinar or conference call blend for the new employees to introduce the new website. Then our advisory team steps in. We could give personal advice for individual direction in creating your portfolio. So the whole circle around that is you worry about maintaining your business. We will manage the 401k plan. Serving as the 338 fiduciary, which is our role, we are taking on as much fiduciary liability and responsibility that the law permits. So those lists of things we talked about earlier in the podcast shifts over to us. There's no conversion fee to move over. The biggest hindrance generally is the existing relationships. Right? It's a matter of unhinging those. It might be a brother-in-law or Joe the broker you met at Rotary or some other event that the biggest difficulty we will see to people making that change is that sort of a fear, I would call it, of going to their existing provider and saying, we have to move on. Because we provide oftentimes empirical evidence to do so, and they can see that a rapid and near-term change makes sense for everybody involved. So the bottom line is it's very, very easy.
Great. Listen, Tom Zagainer and Josh Robbins from America's Best 401k, I want to thank you for spending the time to talk about this issue. It is, both individually and on a national level, it is a hugely important issue because, as you guys both know, and as lots of folks who are listening to this know, most Americans don't get pensions anymore. Most Americans depend on their IRAs or their 401ks for the money that they're going to live off during retirement. And what you've been talking about is how much money they are losing. Could have a profound impact on their ability to retire and their quality of life during retirement. And I just think it's something that most folks don't think about enough. And I hope that they learn some things during this podcast. And if they want to learn more, I would recommend that folks go visit americasbest401k.com. That's americasbest401k.com. Tom Zagainer and Josh Robbins, thank you both so much. This is Richard Bradley from Worth Magazine. Thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Tony Robbins. Listen, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Unshakable podcast. It's the companion to my new book, Unshakable, Your Financial Freedom Playbook, Creating a Peace of Mind in a World of Volatility. And it's co-authored with my dear partner, Peter Maluk. Listen, by listening to this series, along with reading the book, you'll be armed with all the essential facts and strategies you need to help transform your financial life. So if any of the ideas here you've heard today have struck a chord with you, and you're interested in getting a second opinion on your own financial plan or create one if you don't have one, then please go to getasecondopinion.com. That's getasecondopinion.com to have a creative planning advisor take a look at your portfolio or, again, help you to create a plan. It's completely complimentary, completely free, and there's no commitment necessary. I'd also personally love it if you'd leave a review of this podcast on iTunes. I'd love to know what you thought of the program. And also, I'd love to hear any new questions you have, any takeaways you took from the podcast. And if you want to share any success stories about your own journey towards financial freedom, we'd certainly love to hear about it. For more information about my book and some more related articles, videos, and other information that can help you to create that unshakable state and achieve the financial freedom you want, go to unshakable.com and know that 100% of this book's profits are being donated to Feeding America. 45 million people in this country every night don't know where their next meal is going to come from. 17 million are children. And your contribution to this book, 100% of those profits are going to feed them. We'll feed 50 million people with this book, and we'll feed another 50 million, 100 million next year alone, just with the additional bonuses that I'm offering, the additional benefits I'm getting Feeding America as well. So thanks for being my partner, and live strong, live with passion, and we'll hear you and meet you on the next podcast.
The Unshakable podcast was produced in collaboration with wealth management firm Creative Planning. It is hosted by Richard Bradley, editor-in-chief of Worth Magazine, and features business and life strategist Tony Robbins and Peter Maluk of Creative Planning, with special guest Tom Zagainer. This podcast is produced and distributed by Robbins Research International. Copyright 2017.